Let's bring in now our Fox News senior political analyst, Brit Hume, who worked with Charles on this program for many years. You knew him well, Brit, as well as anybody possibly could. Your thoughts tonight?
Well, you know, John, the man was so courageous in the way he lived his life, and he overcame so much, I mean, almost total paralysis, to achieve what he achieved. That when I look at his age, 68, it's remarkable that in some ways that he lived that long, and yet I am terribly sad, as I know so many people are, that he's gone. It's a terribly sad moment.
You know, we talk about his writings, we talk about his intellect, but just the struggle that he overcame to be able to do what he did. I remember talking to him about the accident when he dove into a pool and he dove into the wrong end. He was on spring break from university.
He said to me about that one time that he knew right away what had happened when he hit.
Yeah.
And he's then in med school. Can you imagine? He's in med school. He's gone from being an athlete, a sort of a stud, right? His life is going great, and he said he realized that if he didn't press ahead then and finish med school and move on with his life, that he would sink. And boy, did he ever do that. He just forged ahead. And we used to see him, Charles, Johnny, we used to see Charles around in his wheelchair, and I was astonished at times at the speed with which he could get that wheelchair to go. It would push open almost any door. It was totally remarkable.
I used to say to him on occasions when I was filling in for Brett on this program, when Charles was one of the panelists, we would both be walking down to take the television makeup off, and Charles was always running way ahead of me in his wheelchair as I was trying to have a conversation with him.
And then, of course, there was that remarkable vehicle that he had, John. I remember the first time when he started doing Special Report back in the days when I was anchoring, and we went down to the garage together. I'd never done that before. I had no idea how he got around. I didn't know if he had a driver or what. I didn't really think about it. And we got down into the garage and opened the garage door down there, and there was a van parked there, empty van parked at a certain angle, and I didn't really think anything about it. I noticed it was empty, and all of a sudden the engine started, and I jumped. and I looked down at Charles, and he had that twinkle in his eye. He was chuckling, and then he hit a button, and the door rolled back, and he drove himself up into the position where this specially retrofitted car had a little wheel that he could turn with the one hand that he was able to use, and away he went. And I thought, my God, what that man could do. And he went everywhere by himself if he needed to, everywhere. And I took my granddaughter years ago to the White House Christmas party, and we went down there in the rain in that van. It was great to get a ride because he could take his van up close to the White House on a rainy night. And she had never met him before. My daughter may have told her something about his condition. It didn't faze her in the slightest. She right away saw what we all had come to know about Charles, his extraordinary kindness. And for the rest of the evening, she wouldn't leave his side. She stood there, but all she wanted to do was be next to Dr. Krauthammer. I think a lot of us felt that way.
You mentioned, Brett, the twinkle in his eye as he was pushing the button to start the van and open the door. But that's one of the things that I remember so well about Charles is whether he was heading in that van out to a baseball game, or whether he was just talking to you, or whether he was here on the set at Special Report. He had that twinkle in his eye that always made you wonder what he was really thinking about.
Yeah, he did. But he wrote with a certain piercing clarity that if you didn't agree with him, I think you might have found that thought he was a pretty hard guy. But he was as kind a man as I've ever known. And his personal grace and gentleness were just remarkable. Well,
where I started with you on this was, again, we talk about his towering intellect, we talk about his piercing editorial direction, but just the fact that he could do what he did, given the circumstances of his life, to me really was the greatest statement of what Charles Krauthammer was all about and what he could achieve.
I would always think of him anytime I started to feel sorry for myself for any reason, and that would pretty well snap me out of it.
One of my favorite stories is after he had the diving accident and he knew that he was going to be paralyzed, he wanted to complete med school, and he told me that he was lying on his striker bed with his neck immobilized, just lying there on his back, and he was trying to figure out how he was going to study to finish med school. And he said that he came up with this idea, and he had somebody come in and install a sheet of plexiglass about 3 feet above his bed. And he would get an assistant or the nurse who happened to be on duty to open up the book, the medical book that he was reading, and lie it on the plexiglass sheet above him. So he was lying there on his back reading this book, and then he would say, "Okay, I'm finished. Can you turn the page, please?" And that's how he studied for medical school. Flat on his back in a striker bed with a book on a piece of plexiglass above his face. I mean, just incredible.
And think of this too, John. You know, to look at Charles, this is not a man who would automatically think of as someone who's likely to be a TV star. He became a megastar by the sheer force of his personality and his intellect. And, you know, in the day of, you know, instant news and TV stars and the glamour and all that goes with it, Charles stood out in a way that not a lot of other people could have. He was one of a kind.
And one of the interesting things, and we saw that in the obituary that Bret so wonderfully put together, is you had President Clinton praising Charles Krauthammer, and he was a person who was respected on both sides of the aisle. I mean, my mother-in-law is the most liberal college professor in California, and she loves Charles.
Well, you know, he was so good, and you kind of couldn't get around that. And even if you disagreed with him, you know, I think, you know, there were times through the years when I disagreed with him, but I was always a little apprehensive about doing so on the air, because afraid I might end up with my pants down intellectually, because, as I say, you know, he was in a class by himself.
Yeah, he really was, and yeah, I was really surprised to hear President Trump say what he said about him when he was a candidate. But
well, he said, well, President Trump said a lot of things. I think, you know, that Charles, once Mr. Trump got the nomination, Charles's view was that he hoped he succeeded, even though he was certainly not Charles's type of guy, and you know, that was a sense of Charles's fairness.
Actually, you know, you do remind me, Brit, that I had a conversation with Charles where he said that there was no way that President Trump was going to become the nominee, and I said I think there's a good chance he could become president. So,
well, you were right where a lot of the rest of us were wrong.
Well, that was the one time where I was right, but Charles was right 99.999% of the time.
Yeah.
Brit, thank you so much. We appreciate you joining us.
All the best. Sad day.